Hi, I'm Tripp Babbitt of the Stats Detectives, and in this video, Dr. Froney Ward and I will cover podcast downloads. This will be a series of 4 videos. The first 2 videos will look at a couple different methods to look at data like podcast downloads. The third will be application in other areas, and then the fourth will be a deeper dive and maybe even like advanced types of statistics that you can use to analyze podcast download data or really any other data. Okay. So, Franny, we've done our first 3 videos, and those were all on economic data and things of that sort. And now we're moving on to things that are a little bit more practical, that people can look at these data and say, I have a podcast, or I have a website, or I have, a restaurant, or I have sales or whatever. And so our first one that we're looking at today is going to be podcast downloads and look at some data there. So tell me a little bit about these data, and I've got the first chart up, and tell me what we're looking at.
What we're looking at in the first chart, podcast downloads from January 18 to March 14. What we have are daily values of podcast downloads. And these downloads vary from somewhere in the neighborhood of 500, 600, 700, something like that, up to in the thousands, 1,400 or so. And when we look at the data over time, the first chart goes 2 months just about, and then follows on the next chart that's kind of long, given that we're every day of the week.
Okay, so these are on the individuals moving range chart, and those are also called X moving range charts too, is that correct?
X moving range charts, and that's exactly right. It's sort of a little jargon. X, sometimes people call them XMR charts.
Okay.
But they actually are individual data values in a running record. Some people might refer to them a running record, day after day after day, along with an accompanying chart that not everybody is all excited about, but I am. That accompanying chart is called the moving range, and the moving range measures how much difference there is each day after day after day. So between the first 2 values, you get a moving range, and between the second and third values, you get a moving range. So you get to see how much change happens from one day to the next. And these are all positive numbers. It's the absolute value of the difference between the adjacent data values.
Okay.
And that moving range helps us to understand how much variation is in these data values, how much they're bouncing around. And the cool thing about the individuals and moving range chart is you can get messages about what might be going on in a couple of ways. First of all, these data values, this chart shows some limits, shows an average for the values and an average for the moving ranges. So we see about where the middle is for each of those series. And then we put some limits around them that are figured out by Walter Schuhart many years ago. And we can, with these limits, look and see if there's a point that falls outside the limits. So that's the first thing I do.
Okay.
I look to see if there's anything unusual. And the first pass of unusual is something being outside the limits.
Okay. And so we don't have any in this, at least this chart. We don't see anything outside of the limits of 472 and 1602.
That's right.
Okay.
We do not see anything outside those limits. All right, that's the first pass. And then I've learned over a lot of years that the next thing I need to do, this is some people, is this technique an art or a science? And to some extent, there's a little of both in there. The first part of it is the science, laying out the running record and putting the averages and the limits on there. The second part is still science, but you bring in some context to that part to make meaning out of the series. Notice that we have not only the day of the week listed on this on the little spreadsheet piece up at the top, but we also have the date, the day of the week, and then we have the actual data value, since it's a little bit hard to see what the actual data value is on these on this graph. So you can actually read the data value and see what it is.
Okay.
After I look at something like this and I don't see any points outside the limits, I ask myself, is there anything unusual at all that pops out? And the anything unusual piece is in the neighborhood of pattern or something of the sort.
Okay.
And a pattern has to be pretty darn compelling. It has to be a pattern that is of the neighborhood of knocking you over the head with a 2x4. Because it is so easy to make something out of patterns that are not persistent. So the first thing I noticed, I didn't even have to look for it. It just popped out. Mm-hmm. And the first place that I noticed it clearly was on Saturday, the 20th of January.
Okay.
And then I looked and I saw it on Saturday, the 27th. 27th.
Okay.
Was that yeah. And then no, I didn't see it so much. Yeah, the 20th. Okay. And then it was a while later that I saw it on a Saturday clearly. And then I saw it on Saturday, the 10th of March, is it? And then Saturday, I kept seeing this on a Saturday, and I looked and I saw that Saturday was the lowest point in a group of points.
Okay.
And then between Saturday and Saturday, the points rose up and came back down, almost like a little mountain peak.
All right.
And I saw that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times clearly on this first chart. Now, one of my mentors, Don Wheeler, who has written quite a bit about how to use these kinds of charts, says that if you see a persistent pattern 8 times or more, all right, it took me going to the next chart to continue to see that persistent pattern, but if you see a persistent pattern 8 times or more, then there's something underneath, something going on in the data series. So I said, okay, let's see if we can figure out what it is. The other thing I noticed on here, and I always notice on individuals and moving range charts, is what is the average moving range? The average moving range gives me a sense of what is the average amount of movement from one point to the next? Average amount of change from one point to the next. And this one was 212.5. So what this told me is from day to day, the average difference in podcast downloads was 212.5. Sometimes the difference was less and sometimes it was greater, but that's the average difference.
Okay. And then it has an upper control limit of 694. So what does that tell us?
That just says that if we get a greater change from one day to the next than 694, then there's something unusual happened. And if we are interested in understanding that data series, that time series, then we would look carefully to see what could cause that time series to change that much from one day to the next. Now, on an individuals and moving range chart, typically a moving range value outside the limits is accompanied by an individual data value soaring outside the upper limit or diving below the lower limit. So you have a double whammy in a way. 2 things happening that alert you to, oh my goodness, there is a change in this time series. Now, the downside is looking at a chart like this, there's nothing that pops up and says, here's a change. This is why it changed. The reason for the change doesn't come along with the data value. That's something that you get to do yourself. So you get to investigate the circumstances around the data series, how the data were collected, what else was going on. For example, did your server go down in a way? We'll have an interesting discussion on that. But did the internet crash? Did something happen that caused your downloads to go low? Or did something happen to cause your downloads to go high? Meaning maybe there was a news broadcast that said, hey, go to Tripp, Babbitt, and Froney Ward's site and look at such and such. And all of a sudden, everybody around, the thing goes viral. We get lots of downloads. Anyway.
Okay.
Point goes outside the upper limit.
Okay.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah. There you go. Go viral.
Yeah, go viral.
Okay. And so we see these unusual events here.
Yeah.
And so where do we go from there with these data? This concludes part 1 of 4 videos on podcast download data. The second video will cover where we go next.
Bye.